Good afternoon and welcome to our audiences. Welcome to the Civil Society Readiness for the Green Climate Fund first webinar on understanding briefly what climate finance is and its importance to Namibia. This webinar is brought to you and organized by the Namibia Nature Foundation under their Civil Society Readiness for the Green Climate Fund in partnership with Triple Capital. An introduction. My name is Toini Amutenya and I'm a communications officer at Triple Capital. And among us today is a panel of esteemed and proficient guests from Namibian institutions that deal with climate finance. As we all know, climate finance has been one of the leading topics of discussions in today's climate change debate. And in helping us understand what it is all about and giving us the Namibian concept of climate finance, today with us is Benedict Libanda, Chief Executive Officer of the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia, Bernadette-Shalumbu-Shivute, Senior Conservation Scientist at the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, and lastly, Louise Brown, Climate Finance Expert, Founder and Director of Triple Capital. A warm welcome to our panelists. And before we dive deep into our discussion, just notes to our audiences, this webinar is being recorded and in joining you have given your consent in that regard. And again, audiences, please keep yourself muted and turn off your cameras. And if you have any question for our audiences for our panelists, do put them in the chat box for their reflection. Thank you. So starting forth and to keep on time, we'd like to start with Louise Brown as a climate finance expert. Would you please give us an introduction to climate finance and its importance to Namibia?
Thank you very much, Toini, for the introduction. So what is climate finance? Well, it's a broad term that covers funding that is used to respond to the climate change challenge. And that response can take two main forms. One is mitigation, which is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions or investing in sinks for greenhouse gases in order to reduce the cause of climate change. So that could be things like investing in renewable energy, which displaces energy generation from fossil fuels in order to reduce the emissions from fossil fuels. The other main area is adaptation finance, so funding for adaptation activities, which are activities that build the resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies to the impacts of climate change, which are already being felt. And so why is this important for Namibia? Well, Namibia is a country that is very vulnerable to climate change. We have seen increasingly that it is affecting our lives as individuals and it's affecting our economy. For example, we've seen prolonged periods of drought that has really decimated agricultural production. We've also seen periods of intense rainfall and flooding, which has damaged infrastructure, and these impacts are disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable and the most marginalized people in our society. For example, those that depend on subsistence agriculture, those that reside in informal settlements and don't have strong infrastructure to protect against flooding. So climate change it's both, and it's much more than an environmental problem. It's also a problem that really affects, that really has socioeconomic impacts and that exacerbates inequality. So that's one reason. And in addition to that, Namibia is a signatory of the International Paris Agreement, which is the global agreement on climate change. And as a signatory to that agreement, we have some commitments that we have to meet in order to respond to climate change. So we need funding in order to implement those. Thank you, Toini. You're on mute, Toini. You're on mute, Toini.
Just a second. All right, sorry for that. Thank you so much, Louise, for that insightful introduction to climate finance and giving us a little background on Namibia, as well as the impacts of climate change devastatingly impacting our country. As I could pick up from your discussion, climate finance is funding for mitigation adaptation to create climate resilience in communities. Thank you so much for that insightful introduction to climate finance. Going forward, Bernadette, please, how is Namibia positioning itself to respond to climate change, and how is it thinking of accessing climate finance? Bernadette.
Thank you so much, Toini, for the invitation, and good afternoon to all the panelists or all the participants who have joined us this afternoon. So firstly, I must say that what the government has in place is the National Policy on Climate Change, which aims to secure adequate financial resources for effective adaptation and mitigation. As a signatory to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the country, through the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, continues to work closely with different multilateral and development partners to secure funding for climate change interventions. As the nationally designated authority and focal ministry to these different funding windows, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, the ministry has played a major role in coordinating the development and submission of project proposals to access funding from these multilateral windows. To position itself to access these resources, the ministry has put in place the following policy, regulating and guiding framework, which include the National Policy on Climate Change, the National Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan, which has thus to date lapsed, but it's replaced now by what you call the updated National Determined Contribution. We have in place the GCF Country Strategy, the NDC Investment Strategy, as well as the NDC Implementation Strategy and Action Plan, which is currently under development. So these are the plans that the government has on the table.
Oh, thank you so much, Bernadette, for sharing that information with us, and on the national level, what Namibia is preparing in taking action on climate change, and coming up with all these policies, the NDC, and now working towards the revised NDC. Now we're moving ahead to Benedict. Benedict, the Environmental Investment Fund has been successfully accessing climate finance from the International Green Climate Fund. Could you tell us more about what this involved and what the EIF is doing with this funding?
Thank you very much for the introduction. And let me use this opportunity to thank the organizers of this webinar for inviting the EIF to be part of the discussions. Actually, I would like to approach this question from a multiple dimension, beyond the Green Climate Fund portfolio of the EIF. But I also want to touch on other climate financing that the EIF is undertaking. I hope that will be in line with the objectives of this webinar. From the GCF portfolio, the EIF has been successful with 4 projects that we are currently implementing. These are 4 projects that have been funded through 3 different GCF instruments to the value of $40 million US. The instruments that we are We are implementing, as per the GCA facilities, there are 2 projects, which is the simplified approval process. We were the first, entity, accredited entity to the GCA to access a sub-project, which is, again, simplified approval process. The first project is entitled Improving Rangeland and Ecosystem Management Practice, Smallholders Farmers. And this is a project that is implemented in the Kunene region with different sub-components. Component 1 deals with risk mitigation and disaster management with regards to droughts and other impacts of climate change in the Kunene region. And the component 2 deals with the actual investment measures that we're introducing in the Kunene in response and in addressing climate change impacts, mainly dealing with drought challenges that the region is facing. And then the third component deals with lessons learned. We are in our almost the second or third year of implementation, and we are about to undertake a midterm evaluation for that project. The progress has been, impressive so far, although we have been hampered by, COVID-19 attacks. But so far, we have experiencing, good progress in terms of implementation. We do have a second sub-project which deals with ecosystem-based adaptation. So this project is implemented in 8 landscapes, and those landscapes are scattered all across the country, looking at taking opportunities that are offered by ecosystem to enhance resiliency and adaptation. This is a 10 million project as well, that is designed as an on-grant facility. And we hope that, in the next month or so, we'll be calling for grants for, from those specific landscapes. Sorry about that. That was not me. Yeah, and we've got a third one, which is a full project funded through a normal track. This is to do with climate resilient agriculture in the 3 northern regions of Namibia. This is the Kavango, East and West, and Zambezi. With these projects, we're looking at promoting resilient crop and conservation agriculture, as well as we've been testing, insurance product that deals with crop failure, as well as supporting communities with technical capacity, as well as general development. We have already gone past the midterm evaluation. We are in the 4th year of implementation on this project, and we're looking forward to wrap it up within the next year or so. Then the final project that we have as part of the GCF portfolio is the enhanced direct access. Again, we were the leader to access funding under this instrument. This is an on-granting program that looks to empower CBNRM entities by creating climate change resilient livelihoods through adaptation. This project has also passed its midterm evaluation, which was extremely good in terms of results. If I compare it to the other project, and also we are in the 4th year of implementation, and we look forward to completion and sharing of lessons under this project. Accumulative in all 4 projects, we have accessed more than 160,000 beneficiaries in terms of impact. Cumulatively, we've also maintained and created jobs of more than 3,000, of course, including seasonal ones. We've also been able to retrofit more than 180 boreholes from diesel-based design to renewable energy and solar. So the list, continue in terms of impacts, which is quite evident, in the implementation process. Besides these 4 full projects that we access from the GCF, we do have 2 readiness grants that we also accessed. One was to deal with the capacity building of the ERF in terms of fiduciary as well as monitoring and evaluation. So that was to strengthen our capacity as well as trying to identify gaps that will position the ERF to effectively implement climate financing projects. And the other one was to support the NDA, which is the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, on strengthening the processes of no objection, as well as designing GCAF, programming framework to guide the ministry on identifying projects and facilitating those projects. Beyond the GCF portfolio, we've got also lines of credit for the private sector, which is extremely important because they complement one another. I think it's crucial that I touch on that. That is a line of credit from the African Development, from the Agents for French Development, AFD. So that is a Sunwave program. We are in the 3rd year of implementation, a 46 million euro program where we are working with 3 participating banks, and so far we've financed more than 18 megawatts of renewable energy plants, and that is going well, very well as well. So I think in a nutshell, that's what the ERF is doing when it comes to accessing, climate financing, opportunities and implementation in the country.
Thank you, Benedict, for that great, introduction to the projects that the ERF has been involved in, funded by the GCF. And of course, most of us are well aware of the projects that ERF has been running throughout the years and has done a very great job in that arena, in building climate smart and communal resilience in communities and in farmers' livelihoods. So it really has been evident in that area. So going forward, it's a question for Luis and Benedict. So we'll start with Luis. Luis, how can Namibia scale up its access to climate finance for both adaptation and mitigation activities as a climate finance expert?
Well, thank you, Toini. It's a great question and a very important one. One of the big challenges for Namibia, which is similar to what's faced by other developing countries, is that the scale of funding needed in order to meet the commitments that we've made under the Paris Agreement in our nationally determined contribution, which Bernadette spoke about, and to meet the need of building the resilience of our population and our communities is really orders of magnitude higher than the amount of funding that we're actually currently receiving and that's being invested in that space. So the EIF has been, has really scaled up funding through its access to the GCF, but there's a need for a lot more funding. And the NDC estimate is around 80 billion Namibian dollars needed to meet the commitments that we have made under the Paris Agreement, which is about 8 billion per year for the next 10 years. And the amount that we're actually investing, we don't have a very definitive figure, but according to my estimates, I think it's somewhere around 1.5 or 1.6 billion Namibian dollars if we include the funding that's coming from both the donors and also what we're investing through our national budget and some of the private sector funding, although there's not very much at the moment. So in order to scale up funding, there's a couple of things that are needed. First of all, as Benedict alluded to, the private sector has a very important role to play. We know that public funding alone isn't going to be adequate to meet the needs. So there's a need for the private sector to fund some of the activities, especially the mitigation activities, which can often be revenue generating. So renewable energy, clean transport, activities in the forestry sector, and in the waste sector, and so on. But in order to get the private sector to engage, there's also a need for government policy that creates the incentives for the private sector to engage through, fiscal incentives or, regulatory incentives and disincentives, and also through just very clear policy signals that Namibia is positioning itself as a green economy. And in addition, the public finance plays a very important catalytic role in bringing in private finance. So what Benedict was mentioning with the SUNREF program is an example of that, where there's been some public funding provided through the French Development Agency, which has made, and the EIF has provided some technical support on that project that has allowed the commercial banks to become more familiar with renewable energy projects and to better understand the risks associated with those projects. And then that project actually eventually led to Bank Windhoek issuing a green bond and then subsequently a sustainable development bond. So that role of public finance in creating the awareness, creating the enabling environment, and providing some catalytic funding that can then make the private sector more confident and can reduce the risks for the private sector so that the private sector can come in and invest. So that's also very critical. And I would add that for adaptation in particular, it's very important to make sure that funding really reaches the local level, because the impacts of climate change are very much felt by the communities, the farming communities, the people that are on the front lines and really feeling those impacts in their day-to-day life. So it's important that those communities are given the tools and the capacities and the funding to be able to implement adaptation measures. So it's not just about the scale of funding, but also about making sure that it reaches those that are most vulnerable. And I think that the EIF project that Benedict mentioned of the Enhanced Direct Access project that provides a small grant mechanism for that communities can access is a very good example of that, because it really brings funding down to that community level, and we need more of that type of intervention that gets the funding from the international level, channels it through the national level, and then really allows it to be accessed by those communities at the local level that are on the front lines. I'm sure Benedict can add to that.
Interesting. Benedict, your insights on how can Namibia scale up its access to climate finance for both adaptation and mitigation activities?
That is a very difficult question, Bernadette, but I'll try to amplify where my colleague Louis ended. I think it's extremely important that we understand the global climate financing landscapes. What is there? What is available for adaptation and mitigation? What source of capital or funds that are available for countries to access? It's extremely important also to know that the climate financing required for adaptation and mitigation on the current market, be it multilateralism, private sector, etc., shortfall of the capital that is required for attaining, climate change, mitigation and adaptation results. Yeah. So the small quote that is available is accessed through a competitive basis, and it's extremely difficult, for countries such as Namibia and other small countries to really compete, with other bigger developing countries. Yeah. But what I wanted to say here is that we need to realign our planning systems and processes so that they are compatible with the international agenda on climate financing. For example, our NDPs, the upcoming NDP 6, could be planned in the way that is talking to the Paris Agreement. It's talking to other international protocols that support climate financing and environmental sustainability. That is not only the solutions. We also note that our institutional alignment, capacity building to access private capital is still lacking in Namibia. So we need to invest in institutional development, sector transitions, human capital, so that we access the required, funding beyond the traditional multilateral instrument. Luis has touched that Namibia requires about 80 billion Namibian dollars by the year 2030 to implement the NDC. And that is a lot of capital, and the public funds can only contribute to about 10% of that. So what do we need to do is to increase our ambition of access of these resources from multilateral entities and development finance entities. But we need to do more. I'm glad Windhoek has started doing that, is to capitalize on capital markets. If you look at the global stock currently, it stands at $2 trillion in terms of value. How can Namibia continue to raise bonds through private sector? How can we crowd in different players so that we reduce the financing gap that is required? By so doing, we will also be able to leverage additional financing from multilateralism such as the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, as well as the global environmental facilities, because we'll be able to provide a good co-financing and co-investment options for those entities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Benedict. Thank you so much, Luis and Benedict, for sharing with us, your thoughts on how Namibia can scale up its access to climate finance for both mitigation and adaptation activities. For us to keep on time, maybe I can just go forward to Bernadette and hear your insights on Namibia's expectations in the upcoming COP26 that is scheduled to happen in November. So what is Namibia expecting from these negotiations?
All right, thanks, Toini. Before I go to that question, I actually wanted to add on to this question of the financing to say that since we really need the private sector to step up, what the ministry has done is that we have also endorsed key private sector entities to be accredited to the Green Climate Fund, just to add on to the portfolio to the work that EIF is doing. And these institutions are the Development Bank of Namibia, Bank Windhoek, Namibia Nature Foundation, AgriBank, and recently the ministry has also endorsed the accreditation of EIF to the Adaptation Fund, as the country cap has now been increased to $20 million. All right, and I'll move on to the question that you've asked about the COP. So Namibia is particularly looking forward to the finalization of all pending negotiations from the Paris rulebook. Key negotiation issues that will be discussed that are of importance to us, number one, are on climate financing. We are all aware that climate financing will be the key determinant of success for this upcoming conference of parties. what is really important is that we need to scale up finances for adaptation and mitigation. And this is one agenda item the country will be pushing for when it comes to negotiations. And then there are others that I'll just mention, such as the carbon markets. Namibia is looking forward to participate in this mechanism, particularly in the area of renewable energy and forestry. There's one on loss and damage, which is core and part of the Paris Agreement. However, at this point in time, there's no mechanism yet within the convention to fund responses when vulnerable countries such as Namibia experience loss and damage. And then, of course, one that is very pertinent to Namibia, and this is the agenda on adaptation. Adapting to climate change is key concern for developing countries like ourselves. And when it comes to adaptation, we want parties at the COP to finalize the methodologies for assessing progress in enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerabilities of communities to climate change. I'll hand over to you, Toini.
Yeah, thank you, Bernadette. Very interesting. Looking forward to the negotiations of COP26. I don't know if it's going to be open to the public. It's often closed, but I hope we'll be able to view in as youth and also just, get an insight of what the negotiations will be. So our last questions to the panelists. Again, I think I'll start with Benedict and then hand over to Louise and then lastly Bernadette. Just before I ask the question, I don't know how it's going on the technical side with Miria. I still do not see any questions for our panelists in the chat, but if they are, I hope she'll be able to read them out for us, or maybe the panelists will be able to reflect on them. However, going forward with the last question on our agenda today to the panelists is, what do you wish to see for the future of climate finance in Namibia?
I guess that question is directed to me. Yes, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done for the country to be ready and to access, climate and capital at large scale. And we wish to avail this capital, whether it's grant-based or lending-based, but a balance should be identified to also provide investment opportunities for the private sector, as well as instrument that supports resilience and capacity building from the adaptation point of view. Of course, adaptation remains key for Namibia, and as ERF will work towards ensuring that we scale up our resource mobilization strategies and efforts. Where we're sitting today is that the ERF is undergoing a reaccreditation to the Green Climate Fund, and the accreditation panel has already assessed our application and recommended to the board for consideration of a second phase of 5 years reaccreditation, and that provides us with opportunities to program new projects for Namibia. We have learned a lot over the previous accreditation, and I'm sure we'll scale up funding and improve on access in terms of GCF resources. Similarly, we are in a process of being fast-tracked with the adaptation fund, where we would also like to access resources for adaptation programs in Namibia. But there are other bilateral facilities that we've identified and we continue to explore, such as that of the Blue Action Plan, the Blue Action Fund of the AFD is availing resources to African countries along the Atlantic Oceans. So we are engaging them to design programs, related to adaptation within the fishery sectors. We're also looking at, expanding these kind of opportunities to private sectors, working with DFIs, working with other private equity firms such as the climate managers. All these are perfectly in line with national policies, and coincidentally they support our efforts to raise capital. When I mean policy efforts, I'm referring to the Harambee Prosperity Plan 2, which has got more emphasis on the green and blue economy, and that informs our selections and processes for investment. Above from that, we do have sector policies on renewable energy. We do have agriculture, water, as well as national policies that were alluded to by my colleague Bernadette. So all these, if we use them to our own advantage, I'm sure we'll have quite a dent in terms of resource mobilization for climate financing in Namibia, and we're working towards that. The current portfolio of funding from ECF within the EIF is $40 million US. We can easily double that during the next reaccreditation to $80 million US. But we will need strategic and smart partnership so that we have institutions that are able to deliver on these projects, and we concentrate more on financial administration and resource mobilization. And going forward, we see ourselves expanding this relationship and partners with delivery institutions so that we don't lose focus on resource mobilization. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Benedict. Luis, what do you see? What do you wish to see the future of climate finance be like in Namibia?
Yes, thank you, Toini. I think that Namibia is a country that is very uniquely positioned to be a leader on climate finance, because we're a country that, we don't have a big fossil fuel industry. We don't have a lot of, environmentally damaging industries. And we have a kind of natural comparative advantage in green economic development, and we have a strong track record on sustainable development and conservation of our natural ecosystems. So in many ways, we're very well positioned to pursue a green economy approach. And as Benedict mentioned, that has been already included in the HPP2. So what I would really like to see is for Namibia to really step up. I think we've already taken a number of leadership steps, and the role of EIF in being one of the first national institutions in Africa to be accredited to the GCF, and having, I think, accessed more funding from the GCF than most of the other African institutions. We've already got that leadership, and I'd like to see that leadership really at the country level. So, seeing stronger policy around climate change and climate finance, building on the strong base that we already have. I'd like to see a stronger role for the private sector, which also implies, stronger policy that will bring in the private sector, and the use of, for example, blended finance approaches in which public funds are used strategically to leverage additional private sector funding into the kinds of activities that might not attract private sector automatically because it's too risky. So into some of our, climate resilient agriculture, into some of our renewable energy projects and transport and so on. And I'd also like to see as I mentioned earlier, to see more funding reaching the local level and to see, communities, both, rural communities in the communal conservancies and in the communal farming areas, but also our urban communities, especially those that are the more vulnerable ones, like those that are living in informal settlements and so on, to really see those communities empowered and able to access funding that enables them to build their resilience to climate change. And of course, climate change is such a cross-cutting issue that it really intersects with so many other developmental issues. So I think that we can really use climate finance strategically to build resilience, but also to address issues of inequality and poverty and food security and so on in a holistic manner. So that's the future that I would love to see for Namibia. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. I like that you are quite strong on the point on ensuring that climate finance, finances reach communities or at grassroots level. That is really something that I also look forward to. Going forward, Bernadette, what is your insight? How do you see, or what do you wish to see the future of climate finance in Namibia?
All right, so the future I want to see is that we'll have more entities accredited to the GCF and other funding institutions out there. We'll also have more in-country mobilization of resources. We can look into what we have now, the environmental levies, how is that being distributed, and things like taxes that are currently being collected, how do we use that as a pot for in-country mobilization of resources, as we are now currently aware that it's very difficult. There's background noise somewhere.
Those natural creeping water.
Can somebody please unmute the participant? Yes, I was saying that we need to mobilize resources in country, as it's very difficult. We have seen now that even though the money is out there for the country to access, it's very difficult. The process is very competitive, and we are not guaranteed that we are going to get this money. So we need to develop strategies that will allow us to mobilize our own finances in country, and also how do we bring in the private sector beyond just investing in social corporate responsibility to be a part of this, the financial pot that we are brewing in country, so to say. And I must also say that our country has got very favorable environmental conditions. We know that we have got hours of sunshine and plus strong winds. So we also have the potential that to generate all our renewable energy sources from the sun, the wind, and as well as biomass. And how do we use that revenue that we generate from there, like to our advantage and to fund some of our activities? So that is really the future that I see for Namibia, having most of our finances come from within the country, in addition to what we can still access from the international sources. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your wish or your wishes for climate finance, the future of climate finance in Namibia. And I must say, it has been a really great discussion with our panelists, introducing climate finance, getting a concept of Namibia, and drawing back to the projects that EIF is doing, as an accredited entity of the GCF, and learning some of the national policies of climate finances in Namibia. So thank you very much to our panelists. We have some questions floating in the chat box. I'm sure that most of our panelists can reflect. There's a question directed to Benedict on what types of project is EIF targeting. It's from Newman. What type of projects is EIF targeting to support in the fishing sector?
That's in the fishery sector. There is a lot of climate threats that continues to threaten the sector with the warming of the sea, We also have evidence that there's depletion in certain stock species, and that has resulted in fisheries, in terms of not adequately meeting its quota because the stock is being depleted, and that has now had an impact on job losses, etc., etc. So what we're hoping to do as an intervention is to look at aquaculture along the coastal lines, in the towns of Hentis Bay, towns of Walvis Bay, Sokomo, etc. So there's a lot of adaptation approaches that could be applied within the fishery sectors. That is, onshore aquacultures, bringing that technology from Chile, for example, who have perfected, very well on farming different species such as kabelu, etc., through seawater aquaculture onshore. So there's a lot of interventions that we are looking at. Capacity building at Henganeni Fisheries Association. They've done extremely very well with their members, but they are challenged to expand their source of revenue. It's a very solid, community-based institution, and so forth. So I think those are the kind of adaptation measures that we would like to bring along the coastal side in terms of fisheries.
Thank you, Bernadette, for answering that question. This one is addressed to Bernadette. It's from Oliver Fryer. He or she is saying, thank you, dear panelists and organizers. Bernadette mentioned the carbon market being on the list of the NDCs. How well is it established in Namibian projects, and what potential does it have to additional funding opportunities apart from the GCF and private investors?
All right, thank you, Oliver, for that question. The issue of carbon market is something that we are exploring as Namibia from a government perspective. If you compare our economy, for example, to South Africa, we do not have the type of industry that, for example, South Africa has, where they have those big refineries, Sasol, Eskom. We don't have that. So we cannot, I know what they have currently in South Africa is the carbon taxes and the carbon bills and all of that going on. So for Namibia, we are exploring that, but of course our industry is smaller, but we want to see how can we introduce something like a carbon tax to the small potential emitters or producers or industry. So it's something that we are exploring currently as a country, and currently we don't have any projects ongoing to answer the question. But of course, if it's something that works out, it does have the opportunity, or it does have the potential to fund, to contribute revenue, because it would work like any other tax that the government is collecting from industry, so to say. But
Great.
Louise, please, you can add on to this as well.
Okay.
Yeah,
Louise, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, from the international perspective, the carbon markets have been a very tricky issue within the negotiations because, the ideal approach would be to have a global carbon market in which, anyone can buy and sell emissions from anywhere in the world, and that would stimulate emissions reductions for the lowest possible cost. But the reason this has been the one issue that was not resolved during the Paris Agreement and has continued to be a challenging issue in the negotiations, because it requires setting legal limits on the amount of emissions that a country can emit, and then which they then pass on those limits to industry through an auction of permits or some such approach, and then industry can trade among themselves and internationally in order to reduce emissions at the lowest possible cost. So a firm that cannot cost effectively reduce its emissions can then buy emissions reductions from somewhere else. But the question around how to set those legally binding limits and how to trade when both developed and developing countries have some commitments under the Paris Agreement has been an issue. So right now, the hope is that coming out of the COP26, there will be an international agreement on how the carbon markets would work, and then that would then allow for international trade, which Namibia could then tap into. But as Bernadette mentioned, Namibia is not going to be as competitive as a lot of other countries that have the potential to significantly reduce emissions at a cost effectively. For Namibia, we would, our emission reduction is likely to still be more expensive and less competitive than some other African countries, and especially some of the Asian and emerging economies. But nonetheless, it is likely to be an opportunity. And in addition to the international carbon market that we hope might come out of the Paris Agreement discussions, there are also voluntary carbon markets that already exist, which are not based on regulations, but are rather based on companies and donors that want to contribute to reducing emissions and that are willing to buy carbon credits through the voluntary markets. So that is also an opportunity that Namibia can tap into. And that private sector developers, for example, can look to as a source of funding for activities that reduce emissions through renewable energy, through reforestation, or through even activities that enhance soil carbon, like restoration of degraded areas and areas that are full of encroacher bush and things like that. So those opportunities are out there, but there is still a little bit of uncertainty around the future of the international carbon markets because of this ongoing debate within the Paris Agreement negotiations.
Thank you, Louise. Now, there's a question that I wanted to direct to the rest of the panelists. I think I would actually direct it to Louise, but I think all the panelists can reflect on it. It's from Miria, and she would like to know what are the requirements and challenges in accessing climate finance. I don't know who's going to start on it first.
Okay, I can go first if you may allow. I think the first challenge, there are a couple of challenges that we are facing in terms of scaling up climate financing. One is the transactional cost of accessing climate resources are extremely high. The cost of project development, preparation, the cost of setting up institutional capacity, as well as the human capacity to access those resources are extremely high for an entity. And secondly, there is the cost of implementation, accountability, and reporting. So there's a lot of requirements to account for every cent that a project that is implemented by an entity is supposed to report on. So you find out that such costs they go beyond the provision of the project budget, and entities have to contribute much of the cost, operational and overhead costs, from their own resources. And this is where the questions of additionality comes in and say, we are now spending our budgets that were meant for development on managing climate resources. And these are the kind of discussions that as ERF would like to see at COP, to see how entities could be supported to strengthen system, how the operational costs and accountability costs will be covered by resources provided by the GCF. So it's mainly the transactional costs that are involved in project preparations, the readiness of a country and entity to access funding, the capacity building or the capacity and fiduciary standards and readiness of institutions, as well as the human resource capacities of institutions. So the demands are extremely at high levels. For example, an entity, a small entity which is a direct access entity in Africa, is expected to perform at the same level as the World Bank and the UNDP and other international development agencies. And you hardly find such capacities in Africa, let alone in Namibia. So, and these are the kind of challenges that we are facing.
Would we like to add to what Benedict said, or the panelist?
Yes, if I may, Toini, yes, definitely capacity to access the funds, not just by institutions that are accredited, but also like in country, if opportunities come, let me say, towards the ministry as the NDA, we don't have that capacity to access all of this funding and to submit a concept or proposal on time. So we do have in place now, we have support from the Commonwealth to assist the ministry with support to allow us to access some of this funding, but that of course remains one of the challenges that we really face is the capacity to access this funding for me.
Louise?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with what Benedict and Bernadette have said. Maybe the only thing I would add is that, there are also domestic sources of funding that we can be looking to, including from our own private sector, but also through the national budget. The government does allocate funding towards climate change activities through the national budget. For example, the Ministry of Agriculture has done quite a lot of work around climate resilient agriculture, and some of that has been in partnership with the EIF through the EIF projects, but they have also channeled domestic funding towards that. So I think that we also need to be looking at how we use that domestic funding in a strategic way. Just as an example, for example, there is a budget allocation towards the Ministry of Trade and Industries and SME development for the development of SMEs in Namibia. And of course, many of our SMEs are operating in sectors that are actually well aligned with climate change goals. They're not in high polluting sectors. Many of them are creating jobs in building resilience and engaging in low carbon sectors. So, we could look at more deliberately ensuring that budget allocation towards towards SME development is really promoting green SME development, and that would really help to stimulate our green economy. So I think that we can also be looking to some of these other sources to to be part of the solution moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I'm not sure if we can go beyond time. It's already 3 p.m. I don't know if our panelists have, or any one of you guys have anywhere to be, but maybe if we can take 2 questions, if you allow, from our audiences, that would be okay. But I first need to get the consent from each one of you. We have really a lot of interesting questions coming in. And yeah, first I would like the consent from our panelists, and then I can go ahead and maybe just address 2 questions, and then we'll end our webinar.
We can proceed, Toini. Thank you.
Great. Okay, great. So there's a question to Bernadette. It came from Colin Knott, and he would like to know, can agriculture, crop and land be added to enable accessing carbon markets in the upcoming COP?
I'm not sure if I understand that question correctly. Colin, do you wish to expand on that?
afternoon. Can you hear me?
Very faint.
Yes.
Yes. From your presentation, I took it that in the upcoming COP, you were really going to be pushing forestry and energy to do with carbon markets and not necessarily agriculture. So my question was just, is agriculture included as a vital part of both mitigation and adaptation? And if not, is there an opportunity to get it on the agenda?
All right, thank you, Colin. Now it's clear. Yes, agriculture is considered, or it's lumped under the adaptation negotiation points for negotiation, and the carbon markets is really something different. So yeah, so we are going to discuss agriculture under adaptation.
But not under carbon markets?
No.
Okay. Okay, so Colin, I think, I hope your question has been answered. Going forward is a question, I think it's addressed to Benedict, sorry. It's from Epiphania, and Epiphania says, thank you very much for the info. How can the local authorities go about accessing these funds to support their local activities towards atmospheric pollution? And the second question is, can EIF advise on how the polatic levy be used to support activities of the same nature?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yes, I think what is emerging from the Green Climate Fund is that there's now an African strategy on urban resilience and adaptation, and we should use that opportunities to access funding. And what the time is perfect because we are undergoing a reaccreditation process where we could also design projects, that are alongside urban adaptation. And what is also good about the timing is that the updated NDC also identifies the urban adaptation and resilience as key towards, attaining adaptation frameworks, within the context of climate change. And there are specific projects and initiatives identified by the NDC. So definitely town councils and local authorities, municipalities have got an opportunity now to start engaging with us, or us engaging with them, as well as other stakeholders, and design projects that are aimed at supporting their needs. The landscape has been made available by the Green Climate Fund. It's up to us now to be innovative and see what kind of initiatives and projects to come about. But also looking at the second question now, where the collections of environmental taxes. Yes, the collections of environmental taxes started about 2-3 years ago. They are being collected under the regulations of customs and excise by NAMRA, now who have taken up the functions. I have to say that EIF now is also resorting under the Ministry of Finance. We're working under as our line ministry, so we are working with NAMRA on those issues. The decision is that only 30% is ring-fenced for investment into the EIF, and 70% goes to the Treasury. And the ones that we have collected so far, we have been investing that in a number of areas. One is operations, of course, of the EIF to cover our own overheads as we pursue resource mobilization and capital raising from different sources, because we need to cover for those expenses. Secondly, we are now about to launch 2 products which will where the proceeds from the environmental taxes will be invested. The first product is a green line of credit that we've designed and waiting our board approvals. This green line of credit will provide, lending facilities for renewable energy, energy efficiency, rangeland, especially for farmers, water, biomass, etc. And the line of credit has already attracted about 60 million Namibian dollars in order to be used for such purposes. That is without forgetting waste management and recycling. And we'll be recapitalizing this facility on an annual basis from the proceeds of environmental taxes to support local authorities and other eco businesses that are viable in terms of return on investment as well as environmental sustainability results. So we need to create that balance. Why am I more emphasizing on lending? Is because we need to create sustainable products that are revolving, that are able to withstand the nature of sustainable financing. Of course, we'll continue to access grants for our communities so that we don't leave them behind. Similarly, we'll be launching an endowment facility very soon in the next 2 months. And the endowment facility will be used as a platform for different depositors and donors to provide contributions and gifts that are aimed at addressing environmental sustainability, climate change, and other sustainable interventions. And these proceeds from environmental taxes are used to leverage on the deposits from private sectors and other development partners. So within our endowment facility, we do have a draft manual that will be approved by the board very soon, and 15% of our annual budget will be used to recapitalize the endowment facility. I think I wanted to clear that so that the stakeholders that have joined us today are aware of how the proceeds of environmental taxes as well as other budget and domestic collections are used in the country. So I hope I've been clear on that one.
Thank you, Benedict. And to our audiences, we just want to apologize. I know the questions are coming in and we have left a few that are not, addressed. I sincerely apologize as we are going, we are already 10 minutes over time. So it just shows how much we will really need these kind of platforms to engage and educate each other on matters that are, on debates on climate change. So we will have, interesting webinars following this one. Just please keep a lookout on NNF websites, both on Instagram and Facebook, as well as that of Triple Capital. We wish to see you in the upcoming webinars on the Civil Society Readiness for the Green Climate Fund. Hence, I would also like to give a very warm and great appreciation to our panelists for taking out time out of their busy schedules and joining us today on this interesting webinar, Introduction to Climate Finance and its Relevance to Namibia. It was an insightful discussion, and I'm sure that the audiences have learned a lot from it, and thank you so much for being here with us today. And to our audiences, of course, thank you so much also for availing yourself and joining in today for this discussion. You are really, really well appreciated, and we hope to see this type of engagement in our upcoming webinars. Of course, we have recorded the session, and we hope to share it with the magnitude of you. So thank you so much, and we will now end our webinar. Of course, from the technical side was Miria, and your moderator, Toini. Our panelist was Benedict Libanda from EIF, the Chief Executive Officer from EIF, Louise Brown, Founder and Director of Triple Capital, and Bernadette-Shalumbu-Shivute, Senior Conservation Scientist from the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for joining us in this interesting webinar.